So notice he's making this distinction between those who have an expertise in a particular area, they know the facts, and those scholars who are in a good position to have a judgment. So judgments go beyond facts, right? They're interpretations of the facts that are involved, right? So that's the distinction he's trying to make here. And so how do we handle this issue of, when they're making interpretations of the fact? What facts? What do we do about that? Well, he says in this circumstance, you face kind of another pitfall. Right? A scholar's judgment may be distorted by underlying philosophical considerations that are not always on the table. In other words, they may be biased in a particular situation, right, in some kind of way. And so here, one's destination, right, is predetermined, we might say, by where they start.
Sure, right. Yeah. We talked about that kind of roadmap. You're wanting to travel down the roadmap to see if the directions that they give you take you off into some weird area, and so you kind of the reductio ad absurdum. And so this one is saying, well, actually, where do you start on the map? That's an important point. And in what direction would you travel? You can go east or you can go west.
Right.
Just going east takes a lot longer than going west sometimes.
And he makes the point here that this problem is especially evident in the in science, where subjects like the development of life, Darwinism, or the origin of the universe, cosmology, have worldview implications, right? Because, again, where you start with some of these questions kind of determine where you're going to end up, know?
We talked about this, too, with J. Warner Wallace in our interview, who we said, since you believe in the supernatural, then if someone says a demon killed this person, could that be possible? And he says, well, if I'm being completely honest, yes, that's completely on the table. But I always look at the natural means first in order to start out my investigation. And if all natural abilities are taken away, then where else do you go? You can kind of have a naturalism of the gaps if you want. We just got to wait and see, and maybe we'll come up with new naturalistic explanations for things. But
nature did it, but we don't know how.
Right?
Naturalism of the gaps.
And so we get this when we talk about the origin of life or the beginning of the universe. The time is infinite because it's expanded and collapsed so many times that we're just in this infinite loop. And then you have to talk about two different versions of time, and you're like, well, are you deriving time because you need that to work your model so that you kind of have this unoriginating, first cause, or is there a measurement out there that you're saying, well, here's time one, but here's time two that's off, and there's two different times there. So what are the kind of the reasons for having that? Sometimes it's just, well, I need the model to keep working, so it has to be this, because then the model will be broken. We have to start all over. We don't want to do that. There's kind of these two faces of science he talks about. And he says, whenever you hear the complaint, creation is not science, or something about, intelligent design is just religion snuck in, right? Back in the 90s, we kind of got a taste of that when judges somehow ruled that intelligent design was religion. And actually, we've probably progressed way farther now than we ever have. And there's really good books out there for that. So whenever we hear something like creation is not science, a subtle philosophical sleight of hand is in play. The charge capitalizes on the ambiguity between two different definitions of science. And if you took kind of a walkthrough in Answers in Genesis, or Jason Lyle's Biblical Science Institute, you kind of understand this already. So the kind of the first definition is the most well known. Science is the methodology, right? It's the theory, hypothesis,
experimentation, testing,
conclusion, or revolution. Revising your any one of those can be revised. So you're employing various tools like observation, experimentation, testing that allows researchers to discover facts about the world. Any view that does not follow the right methodology is not science. And so that's just a matter of definition. So you're saying this is the definition that uses this method, and anything outside of that, like healing crystals.
Right.
So healing crystals might be true, but since it's outside of that scope of science, it's not science as a methodology.
Right. So that's kind of the first definition of science. Science has to do with methodology, the method of how the scientist does what they, go through what they do. But there's another second definition of science that he tells us, and this one has to do with philosophy. Specifically, he says the philosophy of naturalistic materialism. Right? So what is naturalistic materialism? Well, notice naturalistic has to do with nature, and material has to do with, physical things. So it's the basic idea here that nature or the physical universe, physical things are all that exist. That's the idea. Right. That's the philosophy behind, he calls this second definition of science. And so all phenomena must be explained in terms of matter and energy governed by natural law, right? Because if only physical things exist, then that's what you have to work with, right? And he says any view that does not conform to the second definition then is considered not science. Right, so that's kind of the second view here of science. Right,
and we talked about this in how to be an atheist by Mitch Stokes. We covered a large portion of that, so I don't have one video to kind of link to you in the cards there, but you can go back and search for naturalism and look for anything with Mitch Stokes there, and so that's what's being brought to the table is, when you talk about, does the soul exist? And so you say, it's an immaterial thing that helps, govern your actions and you can get into figuring out what the definition of it is, but you can't do it through science. No, that's very true, because science has limitations such as talking about the observable world, things of nature, things that you can measure and test and recheck. And so when you say the soul doesn't exist, right, but according to naturalistic materialism, because you don't allow anything outside the bounds. So it's like saying, an apple isn't a melon, so therefore apples don't exist. Well, sure, you have muskmelon, watermelon, cantaloupe, even though it doesn't say melon in it. Okay, those things are melons, and so when you're measuring the concept of melons, you're not allowing certain things, and so those are outside your scope of your definitions. Definitions are important, labels are important, but that's when we say, science can't talk about who God is. Well, that's true, because science doesn't allow for non-material things like God to kind of be brought into the equation. There's at
least under this definition,
right. There's no robe of God that you can clip off and say this is proof of God or something along those lines.
Yeah, you might not want to touch his robe.
Yeah, right. I hear bad things happen. So there are two requirements then for an investigation of the natural world to qualify as science, right? First, one must use the right methods, right? The guess check. Well, not guess. You should never say guess for hypothesis. It's a hypothesis, not guessing. You're trying to make the best inference to the explanation. And so you have to use the right methods. And second, one must come up with the right kinds of answers, those consistent with materialism, at least under kind of the common parlance of what we understand as science. And usually these two elements are not in conflict, right? If we want to get to the man in the moon, we shoot him off with a rocket, and we use math, although there are presuppositions there.
To the moon, not in the moon.
Well, it depends on how far in. Yeah. And so, you're using materials, figure out burn rate, tensile strength of materials, all that stuff to work together. That's what you want. But sometimes they're not compatible. And so what do we do when we talk about that?
Yeah.